Don't go. Your driver has a gun. Aliyah Brooks murmured the words into the stiff collar of Jonathan Hargrove's tuxedo, her breath hitching as her fingers fumbled with the silk of his bow tie. She didn't look up, keeping her chin tucked and her focus on the fabric, but her pulse hammered against her fingertips. Jonathan went rigid beneath her touch, his sharp gaze cutting through the morning air as he stared at the sleek black sedan idling in the driveway. She stepped back, her hand smoothing the lapels of his jacket one last time, a final act of a maid who knew her place, and a woman who had just shattered it. The warning was out. The silence was broken. Jonathan didn't flinch. He didn't demand an explanation. "Cancel the car," he said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that caused a nearby valet to jump. "And get security in the foyer. Now." He turned his back on the estate entrance, but as he reached the heavy oak doors, he paused, looking back at the woman in the grey uniform. "Aliyah," he commanded. "With me. My study." By the time she followed him into the dim light of the mahogany-lined room, her knees were trembling. Only an hour ago, she had been a ghost in these halls, pushing a service cart through the dawn shadows of the Hargrove garage. For 3 years, she had survived by being part of the furniture, a face Jonathan didn't recognize and a name he didn't know. Invisibility was her only armor in a house built on secrets. But then she saw Victor Kane. The head of security was never supposed to be in the private maintenance bay at 5 a.m. Aliyah had frozen in the shadows of a stone pillar, watching as Victor checked the driveway twice before sliding beneath the chassis of Jonathan's car, a suppressed pistol glinting in the waistband of his suit. She had seen the one thing that made invisibility a death sentence. The garage at the Hargrove estate didn't just house vehicles, it was a cathedral of glass and silent machinery, smelling of expensive wax and cold air. Aliyah moved through the 5 a.m. gloom like a ghost, her rubber-soled shoes barely whispering against the polished concrete. She was ahead of schedule, her cleaning cart clicking softly as she pushed it toward the private maintenance bay. In this house, silence was the currency of survival, and Aliyah was its most disciplined practitioner. She rounded a stone pillar and stopped. The silhouette of a man was bent over Jonathan's primary sedan, his body half submerged in the open driver's side door. At first, she thought it was a mechanic, but as the figure straightened, the dim overhead light caught the sharp, familiar profile of Victor Kane, the head of security. He wasn't supposed to be here for another 2 hours. Aliyah's heart hammered against her ribs as she watched his hands. He wasn't checking the engine. He was tucking something beneath the seat, his movements frantic and jagged, not the careful motions of a man performing his duty, but the hurried searching of someone committing a crime. As he turned, his jacket swung open, revealing the heavy, metallic bulge of a second weapon tucked into his waistband. She tried to step back, but the wheel of her cart caught a stray pebble. The resulting screech echoed like a gunshot in the cavernous space. Victor's head snapped toward her, his eyes cold and predatory. Before she could breathe, he was across the floor. "What are you doing here?" he hissed, his hand snaking out to grab her upper arm. His grip was a vice, crushing the fabric of her grey uniform into her skin. I was just starting my shift," Aliyah stammered, her voice small and trembling. She tried to look down, to maintain the mask of the invisible maid, but Victor shoved her hard. Her shoulder struck a concrete pillar with a sickening thud, pain exploding down her arm as she crumpled to the floor. Her cart tipped, supplies clattering loudly against the marble. Victor leaned down, his face inches from hers, radiating a dark, suffocating heat. "You people always think you're invisible, sneaking around where you don't belong," he whispered, the words dripping with contempt. He pressed a heavy hand against her bruised shoulder, pinning her. "You saw nothing. If you say a word, you'll be sorry you ever set foot in this house. Do you understand?" Aliyah nodded frantically, forcing a look of submissive terror into her eyes. Victor straightened, adjusted his jacket with chilling precision, and walked away without looking back. For a full minute, Aaliyah lay in the dark, her shoulder throbbing and her breath coming in shallow gasps, realizing that the safety of her invisibility had just become her greatest threat. Aaliyah stood in the service staging area, her fingers trembling as she ran them over the painful heat blossoming across her shoulder. The adrenaline from the garage was beginning to ebb, leaving behind a cold, hollow dread that made her lungs feel tight. She looked at the exit, the small, nondescript door used by the staff to slip out into the grey morning light, and felt the overwhelming urge to simply disappear. She could walk away now, let the morning mist swallow her, and never look back at the Hargrove estate or the lethal secret hiding in the driveway. But the image of the suppressed pistol and Victor's calculated, predatory eyes remained burned into her mind. If she left, she wasn't just choosing safety, she was choosing to let Jonathan Hargrove walk into a grave. She realized then that her invisibility was no longer a shield, it had become a vantage point. For years, she had moved through this house as a ghost, seeing the unguarded moments, the whispered phone calls, and the shifting masks of the powerful. She was the only one who truly saw the truth because no one ever bothered to hide it from the person cleaning the floors. She forced her breathing to steady, smoothing the wrinkles in her grey uniform with her uninjured hand. She couldn't run. To do so would be to accept the role Victor had assigned her, a person who didn't matter. Instead, she gathered the items for Jonathan's final morning preparations, the lint brush, the polished cufflinks, and the silk bow tie, and began the long walk toward the foyer. Every footstep felt heavier than the last as she approached the grand staircase. She could see Jonathan standing near the mirror, checking his watch with the casual confidence of a man who believed he controlled his own destiny. Behind him, through the glass of the front doors, she could see the black sedan idling, and beside it, Victor Kane, looking perfectly composed in his suit. Aaliyah's cynicism had always told her that the world only saw her as a uniform, a tool to be used and discarded. But as she stepped into the light of the foyer, she discarded that armor of fear. She wasn't just a maid anymore, she was the only person who could rewrite the next 10 minutes of history. She reached out, her hands moving with a deceptive calmness as she approached Jonathan, and realized that once she chose to be seen, there was no turning back. Jonathan went still, the air in the foyer suddenly turning cold as the weight of Aaliyah's whisper settled over him. Her fingers remained on his tie for a fraction of a second too long, a silent, desperate anchor, before she stepped back into the shadows of the pillar. Jonathan didn't look at her, but his jaw tightened, the muscle jumping beneath his skin. He was a man who lived by the blade of his own intuition, and Aaliyah's trembling hands had told him more than any security report ever could. "Cancel the car," Jonathan said, his voice dropping to a level that was dangerously calm. Through the glass of the front doors, Victor Kane's head snapped up. The head of security took a single step toward the entrance, his hand instinctively moving to the hem of his jacket where the weapon was concealed. "And call the precinct," Jonathan added, his eyes fixed on Victor's reflection in the foyer mirror. "Tell them we have a breach. An internal one." The junior staff scrambled, but the atmosphere remained thick with an unnerving silence. Outside, the trap was already closing. Two local police cruisers, likely already on patrol nearby at Jonathan's quiet request minutes earlier, swung into the circular drive, their lights silent but commanding. Victor didn't run, he was too professional for that, but Aaliyah saw the mask of the loyal protector finally shatter. His face twisted into a snarl of pure venom as the officers intercepted him before he could reach the door. As they forced him against the hood of the sedan, the suppressed pistol Aaliyah had seen in the dawnlight was pulled from his waistband. Jonathan watched the arrest through the window, his expression darkening from shock into a cold, lethal calculation. He wasn't just angry, he was re-evaluating every person in his orbit. When the car was cleared and Victor was led away in steel restraints, Jonathan finally turned back toward the house. He looked at the grand staircase, then at the service door, and finally at Aaliyah, who stood huddled against the wall, her shoulder still throbbing from the morning's assault. He wasn't acting alone, Jonathan murmured, almost to himself, his gaze piercing through Aliyah as if seeing her for the first time. A man like Victor doesn't throw away a decade of service for a whim. He was bought. The realization that the threat was nestled inside his own home, fed by his own payroll, seemed to shift something fundamental in his posture. He took 2 steps toward Aliyah, his presence towering and intense. "You saw him in the garage," he stated. It was no longer a question. "And you stayed to tell me." For the first time, the invisible maid was the only person in the room Jonathan truly trusted. Jonathan didn't leave for Manhattan immediately. Instead, he signaled for his lead stylist and a high-level administrative assistant, his eyes never leaving Aliyah. The adrenaline that had sustained her through the warning was beginning to bleed away, leaving her feeling exposed in her stained, grey polyester uniform. She moved to retreat back toward the service hallway, the instinct to hide still pulling at her, but Jonathan's voice stopped her mid-step. "You aren't staying here, Aliyah," he said, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. She looked at him, bewildered. She was a maid with a bruised shoulder and a heart that wouldn't stop racing. She belonged in the shadows of the estate, not in the backseat of a bulletproof SUV. "Sir, I have rooms to finish," she started, her voice sounding thin even to her own ears. Jonathan stepped closer, his presence a wall of expensive wool and iron-willed intent. "The people in this house failed me today. The people at my office are likely waiting to do the same," he said quietly. "You saw Victor because you were looking. I need eyes that know how to see the things I'm too busy to notice." Within 20 minutes, the transformation began. Jonathan had directed his staff to find something that would make her blend into the world of glass towers and silent boardrooms. Aliyah found herself stripped of the servant's apron and draped in a charcoal-colored wool suit that felt like armor. The fabric was heavy and expensive, fitting her with a precision that made her feel like a different person entirely. Her hair was pulled back into a sharp, professional knot, and the bruise on her shoulder was hidden beneath a silk lining. As they walked back toward the foyer, Jonathan handed her a slim, encrypted tablet. He didn't look at her as he spoke, his focus already shifting toward the battle ahead in the city. "From this moment on, you aren't the staff. You are my consultant," he told her. The new directive was clear. She was to sit behind him, say nothing, and watch every hand, every eye, and every twitch of the men who claimed to be his allies. "Watch the people I'm supposed to trust," he whispered as they stepped into the waiting car, this one swept for bugs and driven by a man Jonathan had known for 20 years. Aliyah looked down at her hands, no longer clutching a cleaning cloth but resting on the lap of $1,000 suit. She was stepping into a den of sharks, and for the first time in her life, she wasn't the prey. She was the one holding the light. The car glided to a halt in the subterranean belly of Hargrove Tower, a cathedral of steel and glass that seemed to vibrate with the sheer friction of money being made. As the door opened, the humid city air was instantly replaced by the sterile, pressurized scent of high-grade filtration systems. Aliyah stepped out, her heels clicking against the pristine floor, a sound that felt like an alarm bell to her ears. The charcoal suit felt like a costume that might dissolve at any moment, exposing the grey polyester maid's uniform underneath. Every polished surface she passed reflected a version of herself she didn't recognize, a sharp-edged woman who looked like she belonged in a world she had only ever seen from the wrong end of a vacuum cleaner. Jonathan didn't slow down to check on her. He moved with the predatory grace of a man returning to his natural habitat. They bypassed the main lobby, entering a private elevator that shot upward with a silent, stomach-dropping speed. Aliyah gripped the tablet Jonathan had given her, her knuckles white. She felt the heavy weight of imposter syndrome pressing against her chest, a suffocating certainty that the moment she opened her mouth or even breathed too loudly, the facade would shatter. She was a ghost who had wandered into the light, and she was terrified of what the light would reveal. When the doors slid open on the 45th floor, they were met by a phalanx of assistants and junior executives who parted like water before Jonathan. He led her into the boardroom, a space dominated by a table of polished walnut that looked like it cost more than her mother's house. 7 men and 3 women were already seated, their eyes tracking Jonathan with a mixture of reverence and hidden hunger. None of them looked at Aaliyah directly. To them, she was just another piece of the billionaire's entourage, a silent satellite in his orbit. As Jonathan took his seat at the head of the table, Aaliyah settled into a chair slightly behind him and to the left, exactly as he had instructed. From this vantage point, the room changed. The sharks didn't see her, so they didn't bother to hide their teeth. She watched as one board member leaned over to whisper to another, his eyes darting toward Jonathan's neck as if looking for a jugular. She saw the way a woman across the table tapped her pen in a jagged, impatient rhythm that didn't match her polite smile. The air in the room was thick with a specific kind of aggression, civilized, quiet, and lethal. It was the same energy she had felt from Victor in the garage, just dressed in Italian silk instead of a security blazer. As the meeting began and the air filled with talk of mergers and liquidations, Aaliyah realized that Jonathan hadn't brought her here to be a consultant. He had brought her here because she was the only one in the room who wasn't trying to eat him alive. She took a deep breath, the scent of expensive cologne and ozone filling her lungs, and began to record the shadows that the powerful thought were hidden. The meeting drifted into the arcane language of venture capital, debt-to-equity ratios, sunset clauses, and poison pills, but Aaliyah ignored the jargon, focusing instead on the human choreography unfolding around the table. Jonathan was masterful, his voice a steady blade that cut through the board's posturing, yet he was focused on the numbers projected on the wall, not the faces in the shadows. The lead investor, a man named Marcus Thorne whose suit looked like it had been carved from obsidian, sat directly across from Jonathan, projecting an aura of board compliance. Thorne was the picture of a supportive ally, nodding as Jonathan outlined the expansion plan. However, Aaliyah noticed a glitch in the performance. Every time Jonathan mentioned long-term stability, Thorne's left hand, which was hidden beneath the table's edge, would tighten into a white-knuckled fist against his thigh. It was a sharp, violent contrast to the relaxed, open posture he maintained above the walnut surface. Aaliyah leaned slightly forward, her eyes narrowing as she shifted her focus to Thorne's assistant, a woman who had been silent for 2 hours. The assistant wasn't looking at the presentation, she was checking a secondary tablet that was shielded from Jonathan's view. Her eyes weren't scanning data, they were tracking a countdown clock. Aaliyah felt a familiar coldness wash over her, the same instinct that had flared in the garage when she saw Victor's hand move toward his waist. As the negotiation reached its peak, Thorne spoke, his voice smooth and reassuring. "Jonathan, we're all on the same side here. This merger ensures your legacy." Aaliyah watched Thorne's eyes. They didn't reflect the warmth of his words, they were fixed on the door, dilated with a hunter's anticipation. It wasn't a negotiation, it was an ambush. The discrepancy was total, his body was preparing for a fight while his mouth was offering a handshake. This wasn't a partnership, it was the final stage of a hostile takeover, timed to the exact second the markets opened in London. She leaned in close to Jonathan's ear, the scent of his expensive cologne a sharp contrast to the stale air of the boardroom. She didn't wait for a break in the conversation. "He's lying," she whispered, her voice barely a thread of sound. "His hands are ready to hit someone, and his assistant is watching a timer. They aren't waiting for a signature, they are waiting for a signal." Jonathan didn't turn his head, but she felt the tension snap into his shoulders, his posture shifting from a leader to a combatant in a heartbeat. Jonathan didn't flinch, but the atmosphere in the room crystallized. He leaned back, his fingers interlaced over the polished walnut, eyes locking onto Marcus Thorne with a predatory stillness. The lead investor was still smiling, but the mask began to fray as Jonathan let the silence stretch, weaponizing the very air Aaliyah had warned him about. "Transparency is a beautiful thing, Marcus," Jonathan said, his voice dropping into a register of lethal silk. Which is why I find it curious that your assistant is so focused on a countdown clock instead of our quarterly projections. The woman with the tablet froze. Thorne's fake warmth evaporated instantly, his left hand jerking visibly beneath the table, the exact tell Aliyah had identified. Before Thorne could recover, Jonathan signaled the monitors. Instead of the merger documents, the screens flashed with a live feed of an encrypted server being breached by Hargrove's internal security. You were waiting for the London markets to open to trigger a forced liquidation, Jonathan stated, his tone as cold as the glass walls surrounding them. But I've already frozen the transfer. You aren't taking my company, you're being blacklisted from it. The room erupted into a controlled chaos of hushed voices and frantic typing. Thorne stood, his face a mask of thwarted rage, looking not at Jonathan, but at Aliyah. He saw her then, not as a shadow, but as the leak in his perfect vacuum. Jonathan rose as well, his hand briefly finding Aliyah's arm, a silent acknowledgement of the victory she had secured. But the triumph was short-lived. Jonathan's personal phone buzzed with a priority alert from the estate's security detail. He listened for 3 seconds before his face went pale. What is it? Aliyah whispered, her pulse jumping. Victor, Jonathan said, the name sounding like a curse. He overpowered the transport officers during the handoff. He's gone, Aliyah. And the GPS on his secondary vehicle just pinged 3 miles from the estate. The realization hit Aliyah like a physical blow. The corporate battle was won, but the physical threat had doubled back to the only place she had ever felt safe. Victor wasn't running from the law, he was returning to finish the job he started in the garage. As they rushed toward the elevator, the high-rise felt less like a fortress and more like a gilded cage, keeping them 45 floors away from a man who had nothing left to lose but his target. The Hargrove estate was bathed in a deceptive, silver moonlight when the SUV tore up the gravel drive, but the interior of the mansion was a tomb of shadows. The power had been cut, leaving only the rhythmic, red pulse of the backup security lights to bleed across the marble floors. Jonathan reached for the holster at his hip, his eyes scanning the grand foyer, but Aliyah felt the shift in the air before she saw the movement. It was a cold draft from the west wing, a door left open that should have been sealed. He's already inside, she whispered, the hair on her arms standing up. Victor Kane didn't want a clean escape, he wanted the visceral satisfaction of the kill he had been denied. A floorboard creaked above them, followed by the heavy, unmistakable slide of a suppressed firearm being readied. Jonathan began to move toward the stairs, but Aliyah grabbed his arm, her grip fierce. If you go up there, you're walking into his line of sight, she breathed, her mind racing through the mental blueprint of the house she had cleaned for years. He knows the security protocols, but he doesn't know the service guts of this place. He's never had to scrub them. She led him to a small, wood-paneled alcove behind the library. To any guest, it was a decorative wall, but Aliyah pressed a hidden latch beneath the molding, revealing the narrow, dark mouth of the service tunnels. These were the veins of the house, cramped, dust-choked passages where the staff moved unseen to keep the Hargrove myth alive. They climbed upward in total darkness, Aliyah navigating by touch, her fingers tracing the pipes and raw bricks she knew by heart. Above them, they could hear Victor's heavy, methodical footsteps pacing the master suite, his silhouette likely framed against the window as he waited for Jonathan to appear in the doorway. Aliyah guided Jonathan to a small slat grille behind a decorative tapestry in the bedroom wall. Through the gaps, they could see Victor, his back to them, his suppressed pistol aimed at the main entrance. Aliyah didn't need to speak. She stepped on a specific loose floorboard within the tunnel, the loud clack echoing at the far end of the hallway. Victor spun toward the sound, his weapon trailing away from their position. It was the only opening Jonathan needed. He stepped through the concealed panel with the silent speed of a predator, his own weapon leveled. The confrontation was over in a heartbeat. Caught between the man he was supposed to kill and the woman he had dismissed as a ghost, Victor froze, his tactical advantage dissolved by a maid's intimate knowledge of the shadows. As the backup security team flooded the room, Aaliyah stepped out of the tunnel, her charcoal suit covered in the dust of the service world, realizing that her invisibility had finally, decisively, saved them both. The morning sun broke over the Hargrove estate with a clarity that felt foreign, casting long, sharp shadows across the limestone terrace where the previous night's violence had been scrubbed away. Aaliyah stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of the library, watching the police vans disappear down the winding drive. She was still wearing the charcoal wool suit, though it was now creased and stained with the soot of the service tunnels, a physical map of the distance she had traveled in less than 24 hours. Jonathan entered the room quietly, the usual armor of his perfection softened by the exhaustion in his eyes. He didn't sit behind his desk, instead, he stood beside her, looking out at the empire he had nearly lost. The silence between them was no longer the heavy, lopsided quiet of a master and a servant, it was the shared breath of two survivors. The board voted at dawn, Jonathan said, his voice reflecting a new kind of gravity. Thorne and his associates are being stripped of their equity. The authorities have enough on Victor to ensure he never sees the sun from outside a cage again. He turned to face her, his gaze steady and stripped of the billionaire's usual detachment. None of this would have happened if you had stayed invisible, Aaliyah. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a new security badge, identical in weight to his own but bearing her name and a title that had never existed in the Hargrove hierarchy, Chief of Intelligence. Most people hire guards to watch their doors, he said, holding the badge out to her. I want someone who knows how to watch the people behind them. I want your eyes on every deal, every meeting, and every person who thinks I'm too powerful to be touched. Aaliyah looked at the badge, then at the reflection of the woman in the window. The ghost she had spent years cultivating, the quiet girl who blended into the wallpaper and lived by the grace of being overlooked, was gone. To accept this meant stepping forever into the line of fire. It meant trading the safety of the shadows for the lethal glare of the spotlight. If I do this, Aaliyah said, her voice finally finding the resonance she had suppressed for so long, I don't just watch. I speak. And you listen, even when the truth is something you'd rather keep hidden in the dark. Jonathan's mouth quirked into a rare, genuine smile. That's exactly what I'm paying for. As Aaliyah took the badge, she felt the final remnants of her invisibility slip away. She was no longer a witness to the lives of others, she was an architect of her own. The world was finally looking at her, and for the first time in her life, she realized she didn't want to hide anymore.